Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Edpuzzle lecture. So, this is going to be, I would say, in a lot of ways, one of the big turning points in some ways of the war. It's still relatively early on. We're still only really in 1776 going to be moving forward. But I would say so much of the mythology that we have in our culture that exists, not only around the Revolutionary War, but around George Washington especially, I would say is going to come out of this particular period where weathering the elements, things obviously the very beginning not great for the revolutionaries, right? Not great for the Americans, because the task of defeating a power as great as Great Britain is going to be a very tall order for any nation, and most certainly a young one at that, an infant nation. Okay, so what are some of these early colonial struggles? Well, really after kind of the Declaration of Independence had been issued in kind of mid 1776, General William Howe of Great Britain and 32,000 British troops are going to arrive at the New York harbor. Okay, so as you can imagine, a fighting force of 32,000 troops, that's massive, right? And the idea was, well, this rebellion is going to be ended quickly. That was an expectation held by the British, but then also even by some of those patriotic Americans. They're like, oh, crap, we really are going to have to face 32,000 additional British troops, right? That seemed insurmountable, especially, again, they were better trained, better equipped, better disciplined than this kind of ragtag group of the Continental Army and these local militias. Now, this number sounds big, but I'm going to break this down for you. At various times over the course of the war, it's believed that about nearly, a quarter million, 230,000 Americans are going to serve in the colonial army over the course of the war. But at any one time, that number was actually only at most, rarely ever 20,000. Okay, so again, over the course of the war, maybe 230,000 served, but any one time it was 20,000 or lower. Okay, now that doesn't count those local militias that are all across the colonies, but the kind of ones who are officially a part or are under kind of the command of officially George Washington and the Continental Army. Okay, another big problem the Continental Army faces are deserters, right? That people are going to desert the battlefield. It's easier for some of them to say, well, it's easier to kind of do this back then than it is now, right? But that, hey, I'm just going to leave my post. I'm maybe going to go back home or go to a new territory and restart my life. And people are refusing to go back in and re-enlist. So that's going to be a massive problem for the Continental Army. The British, on the other hand, they're on kind of foreign soil. So you're not going to see a lot of British deserters in the same way you would feel or you would see with the Continental Army. Another big problem with the Continental Army and the kind of organization of the Second Continental Congress in general is they're issuing paper money, which is good in the short term, but it's not backed up by silver. And I'm not going to kind of get deep into the weeds over the economics of this, but it's not going to be the most secure currency. Okay, but one good thing the Continental Army does have on its hands is Robert Morse, who is going to primarily be the funder of the bank. He made his fortune in the Bank of North America. He's going to be the one who actually kind of funds this Continental Army. Okay, so that is something good that they got a big benefactor funding it. And there were some other people who were funding this effort as well, but it still didn't compare to the money that Great Britain had at its disposal to fund this massive undertaking, right? So again, what are we talking about? Less men kind of at once than Britain had, kind of the official Continental Army. People were deserting. Currency was not as stable. And also, they had some money coming their way to fund this whole thing, but still not compared to Great Britain. Okay. So again, what's the difference between these Continental armies and militias? Well, as you can imagine, the local militias kind of, think of it this way. It's like you would have basically maybe a larger militia of North Carolina, but then you'd have maybe a Newton or a Hickory militias, right, that are much more smaller. And that kind of North Carolina militia would be more willing or kind of more apt to maybe be in the larger Continental Army that's kind of all across the colonies versus the small little local militias, okay? Those local militias, as you can imagine, not nearly well as trained in the Continental Army. Again, these are, people just kind of doing it spur of the moment. They don't have that time. They don't have all that training that people in the Continental Army would have, okay? Also, and this could actually be seen a little more as a positive, actually, is that people in the local militias are going to be more apt to use guerrilla warfare. Okay, so they're not doing the whole thing where they're kind of marching in formation right at the British, because oftentimes if Americans fought on those very same terms that the British were used to and were trained in, oftentimes Americans were more apt to lose, right? Because they're just not as well prepared to fight that kind of war as the British are. The British are much better trained for that. But the local militias, and sometimes even the Continental Army did this, but it was mostly local militias, are doing a lot of sneak attacks, are not taking them on head on, that they're kind of hiding kind of in the forests or kind of in any area, and then ambushing and attacking using guerrilla warfare, using the environment to their advantage, where they're not taking them on head on. Like the British would march like this, all of a sudden they're maybe coming from the sides, hiding, confusing the British, coming from another angle, hiding, confusing the British, and so on and so forth, right? So this is always usually the strategy of a smaller fighting force, okay? The Confederacy did this to a certain extent in the Civil War, okay? The Vietnamese did this against us in Vietnam and was very successful. The Iraqi insurgents during the Iraq War and the War on Terror did this. So this is always the strategy of the smaller fighting force across time, is to engage in guerrilla warfare, confuse the enemy. And all this really comes down to this other word that I'll return back to when we talk about the Civil War, called the War of Attrition. What does that concept mean? Basically, we're saying, listen, the Americans are thinking, we don't need to outright defeat the British on the battlefield, because that's a seemingly impossible task. What we do need to do, though, is slowly bleed them out. We need to outlast them over time, make them weaken and make them just more and more frustrated by this, because they could fight this war for a long time, but inevitably the troop morale is going to be bad. The people in Britain are going to want to get out of this war. And if we slowly bleed them out over time, they're finally going to wave the white flag and say, all right, we're sick of this. We're done with this. We're going to leave, right? So again, the longer this war goes on and the more we slowly bleed Great Britain out, fighting that war of attrition, again, just to wear them down over time, then the better off that the American cause has. And again, this is going to be a strategy the Confederacy unsuccessfully uses against the Union, but it's a similar concept nonetheless. All right. So war of attrition, again, you don't got to defeat them kind of head on immediately, but to slowly drag the war out, slowly bleed them out, where they're going to get sick and tired of having to fight it and just going to have to leave. Okay. Because that's another thing. They know that the Great Britain is going to get frustrated, the people in Great Britain, and they're going to say, hey, why are we fighting this war in America? Let's just get out of it. Okay. So what are some of the strategies here? The idea for the British is we're going to use overwhelming force to capture New York City, an incredibly important, city, obviously, in the Americas. And then kind of that's more in the middle. And so that's going to split New England and the South away from each other. Because again, Virginia and Massachusetts, those are the most radical areas. If we can kind of come in the middle, Great Britain thinks, and split them up, then that's going to be a successful kind of strategy. So General Howe, again, this British general, he invites the delegates to the Continental Congress to a peace conference. He says, hey, let's all get together. Let's all talk this out. Okay, but as you can imagine, he also offers the rebels lay down their arms and swear loyalty to the king are going to be spared, right? A lot of these members of Congress realize, no, you don't really have the jurisdiction to do this. The king would have to do this, okay? And this might be a trap that they're setting us up, that we're going to get there and they're going to arrest us, kill us, hang us, do whatever. And so these Continental Congress members rightfully reject his offer, okay? The Patriots realized what a priority New York was for Britain and realized, you know what, we may have to give up New York for now. We'll just lose it, and that's going to be likely, but we still need to put up a fight to keep our morale, okay? So Washington is going to be sent in to fight the British in New York City, and to try to slow the British advance, but ultimately he's going to have to be forced to retreat, okay? So Washington, again, tries to save New York, but they all know that it's probably a lost cause, and we're just going to have to lose that for now, and we'll come back for it later. And so that's what happens, okay? So New York City is going to serve as the British capital in the colonies until the war ends. So at first, the British are successful in this, right? They take over basically the colony of New York, and specifically the New York City, and New York City is going to serve as that British capital Meanwhile, and they're trying to push north and south, the British, that is, right? So they were successful in taking that middle area, but now they're going to have to kind of go north and south to take that, win the war. But New York City is going to serve as the British capital, okay? But the British also are going to invade Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress is meeting. And this is a big surprise, right? Because the congressmen, this was where, again, really the Congress in the Americas was functioning. So they're invading Philadelphia, basically the capital. So fortunately, the Continental Congress gets advance word of this, and they are able to escape in time because they realize that they had their names on that Declaration of Independence, which was a great deal of those Congress members. They're going to be hung or they're going to be tried for treason. So they definitely need to get out of there quick, and thankfully they did. Okay, so this is going to force Washington to divert his forces from New York back to Philadelphia to try to retake the city. Okay, now the British march is going to be stalled by winter. Okay, food and supplies are running scarce. And traditionally, in kind of times of war in this era, way back when, anytime winter rolled in, both sides basically just stopped and were like, well, we're going to basically take the winter off, resupply ourselves, get a rest before we get back to fighting in the spring. So that was kind of part of European kind of battle tradition. And so the British are going to follow that. Okay. But surprise, surprise, Washington and America realizes this, that Britain's going to basically take the winter off. And on Christmas kind of day and going into the next day, December 25th and 6th, 1776, Washington surprise attacks the British forces in Trenton, New Jersey, by crossing the Delaware River, which you've seen this probably famous painting before of Washington crossing the Delaware. Now, this painting was done kind of well into the 19th century, okay, nearly 100 years after it happened. But he successfully does cross the Delaware and is going to kill or capture almost 1,000 British troops. So, again, this was a surprise. I would say this is one of Washington's greatest moments in the sense that he caught them off guard, caught them by surprise. Now, the actual tactical victory of capturing Trenton, New Jersey is going to be small. It doesn't have a massive strategic importance, but it is going to be an impactful victory, right? Because Washington is, at this point, even though he's kind of legendary already, is more known for his the fact that he's lost a lot of battles than he's won battles. But this is going to be a key big victory for him that certainly still lives with us today, that we see that image of him crossing the Delaware, and that's an important national image and kind of part of our national mythology, right? So this was a very successful risk on his part, but a risk that certainly paid off. So again, the tactical kind of importance of taking Trenton, New Jersey, not super important, but as far as the morale and the impact that it had on those troops and on the Americans in general is going to have a big impact. So Christmas surprise by Washington. And this painting was done not too long ago. It was believed it looked more like this than it did kind of that other image of kind of Washington crossing the Delaware. But nonetheless, a very heroic and impactful act by Washington. But what comes next is really, I would say, probably Washington's greatest trial of his whole life, okay? And that comes with Valley Forge. So over time, the British are going to still hold on to Philadelphia, which is going to force Washington and his men to retreat to Valley Forge for the winter of 1777, late 77, going into 1778. So Washington isn't able to take Philadelphia take back Philadelphia the way they had hoped. So he and his men are going to have to set up camp at Valley Forge. And what happens here at Valley Forge is going to be kind of a pretty, as I said, I would say arguably the greatest trial of Washington's life. Because during that winter, bitter cold, massive food shortages, nearly about 2,500 men are going to die as they're trying to kind of make camp in winter here because they don't have a lot of food. People are getting frostbitten, catching all sorts of diseases, okay? But there's hope, and Washington is able to continue to inspire the men and keep them going, okay? And not only that, European help is going to start to come, okay? Marquis de Lafayette was an important kind of French military leader, and Frederick von Steuben. They make their way over across the Atlantic, and they're going to start helping train some of Washington's men in kind of European tactics and European warfare that's going to improve the discipline and morale of those troops there. Okay, so again, this is kind of a very tough period in Washington's life and really for the life of this young United States. There was a lot of doubt that he and his men, are they going to be able to survive this winter, as bitter cold as it is, as seemingly hopeless as it is, food shortages, nearly 2,500 men are going to die, but Washington's able to inspire them to keep going, to never give up. Again, that's really kind of the biggest defining lesson of his whole life. He faced that during the French and Indian War. He's facing that now in the American Revolution. Never give up, never surrender, keep fighting, keep going. And again, that European help slowly started to arrive, and some of those important key military leaders are going to start training up those troops there at Valley Forge to kind of be who they need to be. Again, the images of Valley Forge are still very much with us, right? And this is, again, one of the defining moments in Washington's whole life. And what really adds to his mythology is this heroic figure in American history, okay? And you still see this kind of today. I mean, this here is actually kind of World War II propaganda. No one had to tell him to save food and equipment, right? That was inspiring kind of the people during World War II to it was hearkening back to Valley Forge. Here is some of the European leaders and tacticians who came to were helping train some of those American troops there. And then also, again, this image of Washington as this heroic figure. And in many ways, this is kind of hearkening back and kind of making him this almost religious leader in the sense that he's praying, that he's kind of putting his faith in God. And again, that adds to his grander mythology as an American figure in American history. But the tide is going to start to turn here in the Americans' favor with the Battle of Saratoga, which takes place kind of in September and October of 1777. Okay, so in this battle, the British are going to be commanded by General John Burgoyne, while the Americans are by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, who I'll talk about a little more tomorrow. Okay, so this is going to be a big success for the Americans. 5,000 British soldiers are taken prisoner. This is a massive success, again, for the Americans. And the fact that they're able to kind of defeat the British here is going to be a big turning point. Huge morale booster for America, and also turning point in general, okay? Because it's going to convince France to invest seriously in the American war effort. They've been sitting on the sidelines and have been watching this go on for a few years now. This kind of the victory at Saratoga is going to be one of those turning points for the French to say, okay, you know what? The Americans are serious here. They defeated the British in a big, mighty way, and we're going to now send even more troops, supplies, money. So Saratoga, the turning point of the war. After this point moving forward, it's not going to be totally all American victories, but the tide has turned, and America is going to kind of be on a series of winning streaks after this. But again, that's in large part due to the French finally saying, all right, you know what, we're going to invest in America, not just to get revenge against the British, which they would love to do anyways, but they see that something of themselves in America as well. And we'll talk more about that when we get towards the French Revolution. But on February 6th, 1778, this is great news for Washington at Valley Forge, while he's still going through this, France is going to recognize U.S. as an independent nation. This is also big, right? Because the United States had not been officially recognized in this kind of year and a half after the signing of the Declaration. Now we have one of the biggest powers in the world, France, saying, you know what? No, the United States is an independent nation. And another treaty officially names an alliance between France and the United States. So again, this is kind of imagine yourself as kind of hanging out with a new crowd, and no one really likes you or knows you all that well. But all of a sudden, one of the biggest people in that crowd says, no, you know what? They're good. They're with us. And that really validates the United States on the international scale, that now all of a sudden America has been validated by one of the great world powers. And so that's going to put even more cachet and even more influence headed our way. So that's good. So again, Saratoga, turning point. Yeah, sure, we did take a lot of British prisoners, and it was a big morale booster. But more than anything, it's going to get France on our side officially, and certainly supporting us and ultimately on the path to victory. So that's that for today. This is Mr. Huffman signing off. As always, if you have any questions about anything, please reach out and I'll answer them. Take care.